I think the last time I made a video about a GameCube mod, I remarked upon how it's been so long since there's been a new mod for the GameCube. But today, as I'm recording this video in November 2024, we're actually doing pretty well. There are 4 mainstream mods for the GameCube that are on the market. And one might think, are they improving upon each other? Or are they simply for different end users? I'm your cool Uncle Marissa, and I initially thought the latter. However, I am coming to you pretty convinced that great strides have been made. That's right, this video is about the Flippy Drive, developed by Team Off-Broadway. I got mine through Crowd Supply just like everyone else, and I installed mine a couple of days ago, and I figured I would show you guys how to go about it. But before we get into that, let's just go over some background of what do these mods do, what is the history of GameCube mods that have been available, and what is the end user for each of them. Let's start from the beginning, when a very bored Tyrannosaurus Rex decided to make the Xeno GC chip. The Xeno GC chip was, from what I found, made to be open source in 2011, so it probably came out not long before that. This mod chip is a quick solder board that is installed onto the GameCube's motherboard. And essentially it unlocks your GameCube in the sense that you can switch regions and you can boot Swiss, where you can run homebrew games and backup games. Being a quick solder board, it definitely presents challenges. I've noticed that a lot of people seem to be team like wired as opposed to team like quick solder, which makes sense because it's easier to check your work with wires, it's easier to undo things. And the Xeno GC was actually my first home console mod, and for a while I could no longer bear the sound of the GameCube boot logo because I just kept installing, testing, something was wrong, trying again. But I did a couple of more Xeno GameCube mod chip installs after that, and they were all quite smooth. Now, how did that actually run? So the earliest, I think, exploits were through a couple of games. I think Wind Waker and Pokemon Coliseum. You can correct me on that, but I definitely know Wind Waker because the person who got me into the understanding of the mod chip and stuff, they sold me a copy of Wind Waker, which ultimately is wonderful because I got an affordable copy of Wind Waker and it is now my favorite Zelda game. All that being said, you had to have an SD card to memory card adapter, and you would run an exploit using the disk to boot into Swiss. Now, this was not ideal for a few reasons. First off, you are wearing out the drive, which as the years go by sounds like less and less of a ridiculous complaint. You are wearing a disc that is quite valuable as far as GameCube games go. Like, it's not just some random sports game. These are both rather expensive, valuable, and sought after games. It's not super intuitive. And one thing I have to admit off the bat, I hate Swiss. It's so ugly and it always gives me some sort of trouble in a very micro way. For example, the fact that I can't use my modded GameCube controller with Swiss for some reason, and it can act weird over SCART or component, even if you adjust the settings. Anyway, that was the initial, and then after that it was much better with Nick Disc selling a disc that would boot Swiss, and you would use that along with the SD to memory card or an SD to SB2, which is just a little guy, goes in the serial port 2 under your GameCube and takes a micro SD card. So already we are moving ahead. We're going from big SD cards to micro SD cards. My goodness. Next, we have the GC loader. According to RetroRGB.com, it came out in 2019, which is a long time. And it is really expensive. So the Xeno GC is super cheap. You can buy it for a couple of dollars off AliExpress. It's very easy to find because it's open source. Everyone's selling clones. I mean, the original has not been made forever at this point. And Nick Disc's DVD CD? game disc? What are these tiny discs? Along with any of the adapters, were also fairly affordable. The GC loader is $100, which nothing to sneeze at, both in terms of sneezing at it for being expensive, but also sneezing at it for being affordable. It's a big sum, but there are quite a few mods this expensive. I myself have installed the X Station on the PS1, which is also one of the most expensive, I think, mod chips still, and the price, like the sticker shock between the two is insane too, because you can get a PS1 for like $20 and then you drop all this money on the mod chip. But in the case of the GC loader, it's only a little bit more expensive than buying a GameCube, which I don't know if that's better or worse in terms of financial decision making. But what makes it so expensive? What is the point of it? What makes it different from the Xeno GC? The GC loader straight up physically replaces your disk drive with a SD card slot. That's it. And because of that, it was for the longest time the only solder-free solution. And it's not a matter of just soldering one wire with the Xeno GC. It's a quick solder board, quite a few points, pretty challenging to do, especially if you have no solder experience or the extent of your solder experience is just wiring up some things. So I can see how it was attractive. Of course, the issue is it replaces your disk drive. So if you do want to still use your disk drive, that's no longer an option. It, I suppose, is a good option for someone whose disk drive just doesn't work anymore, but it's not something that I ever personally tried. It seems like people who had tried it were quite happy with it, but for me, it felt a bit sacrilegious and expensive. So for the time being, we had those two. And then the revolution happened with PicoBoot. I believe the PicoBoot came out in 2023, given that is when I published my video about it, which again was my second Cool Uncle Mods video and my fourth video on my channel. How time flies. The PicoBoot was amazing because you could maintain your disk drive, but also it had a lot more features than just a Xeno GC. You no longer had to spin a disk in your disk drive in order to get Swiss to load, which is a huge improvement. Everything was just in there. It is a boot replacement. It just has IPL in there. And that paired with a micro SD to memory card adapter, and you are all set. Plus the fact that it runs on a Raspberry Pico meant that you can look forward to future updates. You can just mess around with it a lot more easily, put custom boot logos, etc., etc. Plus the fact that it doesn't require a disk to run made it stiff competition for the GC loader because you could use it without a disk drive. It effectively could be a disk drive replacement. Also, it was another one that could be completed for under $10. So it was absolutely just a no-brainer. And for me, that was perfect as well, because while the Xeno GC did essentially everything that I needed, I didn't like having to run my disk drive every time I'm booting into Swiss. So that was a huge solution. And shortly after PicoBoot came out, there started to be talk of the Flippy Drive. Shout out to John5, who commented, I think, on that video asking, are you gonna look at the Flippy Drive? And at the time I hadn't heard of it. I looked it up. It was, I think, just started development, but it had very recently become a topic of discussion. So I said, yeah, when it comes out, maybe I'll check it out. But frankly, I wasn't super interested, and here's why. The Flippy Drive is doing what the PicoBoot does, from what I understood. It runs without a disk drive, but it also runs with a disk drive. It's a no solder solution. Now that, I was like, that is going to appeal to a lot of people who don't know how to solder, who don't feel comfortable soldering, or whose soldering skills just aren't up to the solder directly to your motherboard, and if you mess up, you will damage your GameCube level, which both the PicoBoot and the Xeno GC require you to be able to do. But for me, I wasn't sure where the appeal would be because I can solder. I have soldered. I don't know how many mods I can keep stacking into this one for GameCube. So that was that until a couple of months ago when the Flippy Drive was announced to launch. And it was launched via crowd supply, which now I understand is kind of like Kickstarter, but for like super nerdy techie projects. Like even when I got my Flippy Drive in the mail, it was packaged the way Mouser or DigiKey package their stuff. And honestly, I was pretty negative from the beginning because I was like, I've never heard of crowd supply. This is weird. And then I couldn't get my order in. And then when I did get my order in, it was like, you're not gonna get it till 2025. And I was like, is this really worth it? Because at that point I was kind of doing it for the review and to fulfill the request of, hey, are you gonna look at the Flippy Drive? I mean, if you've been asking me if I'm gonna look at the Flippy Drive for a year, I can't let you down. But shortly after, they actually went ahead and addressed that a lot of the people buying were scalper bots and bots and just, you know, I feel like a robot could just play GameCube games in their head. They don't actually need a Flippy Drive to do so. So that rewound my order date all the way to November, which is this month, and which is when I got mine. And that, my friends, is actually when I decided to look at what the heck is this thing anyway and what's the difference. And honestly, it's not that different from the PicoBoot in terms of practicality, except the part that it has a front end. It looks like a part of the console. It looks so good. Like, it's not just some like .txt looking file, career new, blank background. Your games actually show up with little icons with pictures, and when you select it and you want to play, it looks like an arcade machine kind of, and it is so joyful. Like, I'm used to every sort of mod, you know, kind of not having that a front end. Like even a flashcart just takes you to like a .txt career new looking file, right? And you just find what you want. So that's so crazy to me. It's amazing. It looks beautiful. And it's, I believe it was around $50, which is completely a valid price. I do think that they said they are going to open source it so people can make more adjustments and advancements to it, but there's also a lot down the pipeline. So it has the potential for Wi-Fi capability, which means you would be able to transfer files and updates and all that over the air as well. And we'll talk a bit about why that's important at the conclusion of this video, but it's just, yeah, a lot of potential. In terms of placement, it goes kind of, it lands the physical Flippy Drive on the outside inners of your GameCube, and that makes it really accessible. My PicoBoot is actually very accessible thanks to Helder's Tech's little like extender board. So that sits on the side as well, but the PicoBoot on its own doesn't have that. So that's also really neat, and everything's just kind of hidden away. But the front end, that's what really got me, and I really hope this can pave the way to more like home console mods trying to make something pretty. I don't know, it's neat. So with the Flippy Drive, let's say you, like me, have put every other mod is soldered into your GameCube. I double checked with Team Off Broadway and they emailed me back, and the Xeno GC has nothing to do with Flippy Drive, so you can leave that on there. And with the PicoBoot, that can interfere with the Flippy Drive, and they did say, you know, it depends on the firmware, but the best option is just to erase it. And so I'm gonna show you how to do that. You don't have to desolder it to erase the firmware. You're essentially just disabling it. And this is actually, you know, pretty nice because if for some reason the Flippy Drive doesn't do it for you, you can just uninstall the Flippy Drive. It's easy. There's no soldering or anything, just some screws, and just flash the PicoBoot firmware back onto your Pico, and it's like nothing ever happened. It was all a dream. As for what you need for this mod, other than the things that are included in the Flippy Drive, you need a game-bit screwdriver for the 4 obnoxious screws under your GameCube, and Phillips screwdrivers for the screws inside the GameCube. That's it. A micro SD card formatted to FAT32. If you've formatted one micro SD card for any sort of gaming purpose, you've formatted them all. Anyway, with those in hand, let's go install this thing. First off, for the PicoBoot users, I've linked Flash Nuke in the description. All you need to do is press and hold the button on your PicoBoot while you connect it via USB-C, drag and drop Flash Nuke, and then wait, don't unplug it. When the window reopens, that's when you know that it has been nuked. And then you can test it as well on your GameCube to make sure. And then let's move to the Flippy Drive. It's tiny. It came in a really big box, but it's a very small package, very compact. So this is the ribbon cable that goes into your disk drive slot. This is the 3D printed stand that holds the Flippy Drive in place. This little 3D printed guy plugs the disk drive up once you put the ribbon cable in if you do not have a disk drive. This is probably good for people moving from GC Loader to this. And then we have our Flippy Drive with 2 screws and 2 extra screws. And now it is disassembly time. If you have a Game Boy player, you can use a flathead screwdriver to take that off. But honestly, when they say cash is king, the reason they say that is because a dime is the best way to undo these screws. For the non-US people, that's just the smallest coin currency, physically, not monetarily. Next we have the 4 game-bit screws. These are so annoying, in my opinion, but at least there's only 4 of them. I have my own little Frankenstein version of the screwdriver, but if you are getting a game-bit screwdriver for this purpose, make sure it is long, because otherwise it won't reach the screws. They're pretty deep. The screws might not all come out, so gently flip it over and they should fall out if they have been completely unscrewed. And then we just lift the top off. It's a very simple one. While you're working on it, just be careful of the optical drive laser. You don't want to scratch it up or anything. If you want to protect it, you can put a disc that you don't care about too much on it. You can cover it with Kapton tape, etc. Anyway, here's my PicoBoot. We can unclip the front I/O panel. You don't have to unscrew it or remove the ribbon, just leave it out. And then we're going to take out the 2 little shields in the front, the metal shields. You need a wee Phillips screwdriver for those and just set them aside. I like to set them aside with the screws in because they're very long and it just helps me keep track of everything. So now we're going to go ahead and tackle all the screws. There's so many screws that are around the GameCube on each of the 4 sides. And we're also going to tackle removing the PicoBoot. If you have the same flex board that I do from Helder or something similar, this should be a good tip for you as well. We'll get to that. I could have done this earlier, but of course take off the back I/O board as well. That also just pops off. Right, so with the PicoBoot, we're going to take this plastic spudger, and I'm just going to gently keep wedging it between the board and the GameCube so that it lifts off nice and smooth and I don't damage either one. And then I'm just gonna let it hang. And then you can remove the fan as well and let it hang, and there's 3 screws under that. Keep that in mind for reassembly. I literally always forget, and I have to screw and unscrew the fan a couple of times. And you would think for the number of times I've opened up and closed a GameCube, I would remember, but no. Once all the screws are out, we're just going to lift up the disk drive. Don't force it. It should come up with just a little bit of pressure. It's plugged in at one point, and that is on the bottom right where we see the little black rectangle under the silver heatsink. So that is the only place you should be expecting any tension while pulling it out. And from here, we're going to do what's ostensibly the most challenging part of this mod, which is inserting the flex cable into that disk drive connector on the bottom right. Before we do that, we can do a little prep suggested by the FlippyDrive doc of taking our bracket and inserting one screw into the little screw keeper. This is just one of your GameCube screws. It's just there for safekeeping, really. Very clever. So the best way to think about folding this ribbon is you want the 2 sides of the gold pins to go over each side of the inner piece in your disk drive connector. So they're going to embrace it. And the short side is going to be on the left, while the long side is going to be on the right, sticking out of your GameCube. You also want the triangle on the right side to be the one that is facing you as you are working on it from this angle. The other side has a square, so that is how you can differentiate them. Here I realized since it wasn't embracing it as much, I created the crease a little bit closer to the gold pins. It's definitely finicky. Don't make any strong folds. You want to crease, not fold. All right, and then once it is embracing that middle bit perfectly and tightly, you can crease the 2 sides that are sticking out around the edges of the connector. Next, we're going to take that long bit and we're going to snake it around between these 2 bits on the right. So many bits. And then we can put the disk drive back on. Similarly, you don't want to exert too much force. If you're having to exert too much force, then something is probably in the way. You don't want to damage the flex cable. It should go in fairly easily. As for the bit of the flex cable that is sticking out, you want it to stick out of this metal bit. So do pay attention to that when you are putting the disk drive down so that it doesn't get caught elsewhere and get bent. If you don't have that gap in yours, you can create it by gently pulling on that metal shield. And we would have just put this into the disk drive slot if we didn't have a disk drive. Moving on to the actual Flippy Drive, we want to connect the flex cable to it. So we have this little connector right here, and just take a look at it from the side. If the flap is open, leave it open. If it is not, open it by putting pressure on the middle and lifting. If you lift from the sides, it does risk breaking. Then we can install the bracket that's going to hold the Flippy Drive, and we're going to screw it into place, again using the GameCube screws. Once the bracket is installed, we can put the ribbon into the Flippy Drive's connector. Wonderfully, there is a triangle on one side of the Flippy Drive and a square on the other side, just like the ribbon cable, so you know you are installing it with the correct side. And once it's all the way in, you can close the flap, again, putting pressure on the center, not the sides. And with all kinds of ribbon cables, I give a gentle tug to make sure that it is actually in place and it won't pop out. The Flippy Drive seats very naturally against the bracket, and then you can use the included screws to screw it in place. I would go between each screw, giving a few rotations at a time so that we're not exerting too much pressure on one over the other, and we can get a nice and even install. Now that the Flippy Drive is installed, we're just going to connect it to our TV to make sure that it works before closing it all up. Now, when I connected it via component, I got this, which is not ideal, but thankfully this just shows up during the setup screen. Hopefully this doesn't happen with an HDMI connection because I know a lot of you guys are not using CRTs. But once I switch to composite cables, it is crisp and normal. Not crisp, just normal. Component is the one that's crisp. But yeah, it just starts to update, install, and this is without a micro SD card. This is just all on the Flippy Drive itself. You can put the micro SD card in before you do this or afterwards. With the micro SD card, you can put the update file on that is linked in the docs and GitHub that will be in the description. And otherwise, any backup files that you need, you just put them directly to the root of the SD card, which is pretty cool. There is nothing finicky about it. I'm gonna fast forward through this, but also if you are in a similar situation as me, once this update and just this like kind of configuration screen is gone, you can switch back to your component cables or SCART cables or whatever is not composite. And it is, in that instance, very crisp. So that is a reprieve, at least. I was really worried, like, it just doesn't work over a component cable. That would be very odd. And we get the GameCube boot logo, which is really awesome. I hate it when mods take away the boot logo for anything. And we just go up to gameplay, and there's PicoBoot, the front end for Flippy Drive. And here's where all of your ROMs would show up. And they would show up as little icons, like the GIF that I shared in the intro. It's so clean, it's so seamless, absolutely incredible. In the docs, it tells you certain shortcuts you can do. For example, if you press and hold the left trigger button while booting up your GameCube, it will boot into the disk drive. There's just a couple of different options, but those will be linked in the doc. While you're here, if you'd like, if you have a soldering iron and know how to do so, it's not a bad time to change the clock battery on your GameCube so that you can have an accurate time and date. Once that's soldered, we're just going to go backwards and put everything back. Again, as a reminder, make sure you put the screws in under the fan before you install the fan, because otherwise that will be annoying. Also, install the fan after you put in the screws on the back side, because the protruding end of the fan where the power button is will interfere with your screwdriver, so that'll be annoying. I'm telling you this so you don't have to go through the immense suffering that I did. And I'm not going to show you the complete reassembly because otherwise you will witness my suffering of the forgetting about the fan. We're back! It's installed! What do we think? Amazing. I think amazing. It's so nice. Who is this for? Everyone. I think we've kind of been going in twos. You know, you had like the Xeno GC and GC Loader, and it's like, who is it for? And it's like, well, one is for if your disk drive works, one is for if it doesn't. And then it was like PicoBoot and GC Loader. Which one's for who? Well, GC Loader is for people who don't know how to solder, like to that extent. PicoBoot is for people who do. And now I really thought we were going to be like Flippy Drive or PicoBoot, but no, Flippy Drive. Unless you really can't spare the cost of the Flippy Drive, which is completely understandable in this economy, then I'm not sure why you would go for the PicoBoot at this point. Yeah, it is peak, and it's just gonna get better from here. But of course, I have complaints. I always have complaints. No, I'm kidding, but like nothing is perfect. And especially this being early on, there are a couple of things that did, make me go, ooh, I wish. So at first, I genuinely did not think twice about it. I thought this would work with the GC to SD adapter. Because I don't know, why wouldn't it? But unfortunately it doesn't. The SD card has to only go into the Flippy Drive. It can't access an SD card anywhere else. Now the issue for me with that is that if you want to add things to your SD card, instead of just popping it out of your GC to SD and putting it in your computer or whatever, you have to open your GameCube. Now, arguably, it's not the most challenging thing to open, but it's annoying. And you don't want to strip screws. You don't want to like just accidentally do something just because you want to add a game backup or any piece of homebrew to it. Now, while I know that Wi-Fi is being worked on to create like a piece of software or something to use on your computer and be able to transfer files like that, it would be really great to have an easy offline method of doing so. So I would really like that to happen. I'm not technically inclined enough to understand if it's possible at all or not, because I'm like, even if we could just put the firmware in the SD card that goes in the Flippy Drive and then put ROMs and stuff on the GC to SD card, like that would be fine as well. That would be, I think, a really great solution as well. So yeah, that's something that I don't love. One of my nerdfuse in my Discord pointed me to a micro SD extender that allows it to, I guess, poke out so you don't have to open your GameCube every time. But it was $25, and I'm like, that's half the price of the Flippy Loader. I would much rather wait and see what they have to do, or wait for this to be mainstream enough for someone else to make an extender, because $25 is relax, okay? The second thing was just a weird little thing that I had, which was with my CRT, and I've had this happen with Swiss too before. During the setup, whenever it's on the setup page, where it's the white page and you pick like, are you booting Flippy Drive, are you booting Swiss, you want to update Flippy Drive, all that. It doesn't work over component cable on my CRT, and I'm assuming it wouldn't work over SCART either, because with that I'm feeding component into an adapter which feeds out the SCART. So I have to switch to composite cables. That's very strange. I don't like that, and one reason that is more annoying than it would be if I was just going to that menu to like update and stuff is I actually wanted to do the boot mode as being bypassing Cube boot and going straight into regular GameCube unless I press and hold X. However, when I do that, when I press and hold X, the menu's all warped and I can't see anything that's going on screen. So I don't want to have to plug in composite every time. I just want to do that. So for the time being, I have it set to normal boot. Both of these issues I have added to the issues section of the GitHub, so I'll keep you updated if they update them, because I think these are both reasonable quirks. But otherwise, especially for something that's just getting off the ground in terms of a public release, it is very impressive and very nice, and I Highly recommend it. Thank you so much to Team Off-Broadway for putting so much thought into this. Even the fact that it sits on the opposite side of Helder's PicoBoot ribbon, I was like, is that on purpose? Or was this just the happiest coincidence in the world? But I'm inclined to believe maybe it was on purpose. So yeah, thank you guys for all the thought that you've put into this. This is very huge for the GameCube, but also what we can see modding a home console as more than just a text-based list that looks kind of, not very aesthetic, huh? And thank you, John5, for mentioning the Flippy Drive in the first place, and the rest of you watching as well. I hope this video was helpful. Let me know if you've got your Flippy Drive, if you're waiting on it, how your installation experience was, if you're considering getting one now. Do you have any complaints about it? Do you have anything that really stands out to you and makes you excited about it? A huge thank you to my Ko-fi supporters, to you for watching the video through to the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're into this sort of thing. And don't forget that you're always welcome at Cool Uncle's house. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.